All right, so in this video, we're going to look at how to perform group by aggregations using polars, and we'll also look at how to pivot data because those two things, at least in my workflow, tend to go hand in hand quite often. All right, so as has been the typical case during this playlist, I've got my starter code, import pandas and polars, and create my pandas and polars versions of that store sales forecasting data. All right. So let's just look real quick at our pandas data frame. All right, so let's say that we wanted to figure out, just do some basic analysis of figuring out, okay, well, can we determine what's the number of unique orders by subcategory, right? So we've got like bookcases, chairs, tables, and then here we've got order IDs. So how many unique orders contain a product from the bookcases subcategory or the chairs subcategory? Okay. So how we would do that with pandas, we would say, okay, well, we're going to do a group by. All right. And then I'm going to give it a list here, even though I'm only going to provide one column. I want to group on subcategories. So I want to figure out for each subcategory, how many unique order IDs. So I'm grouping on subcategory, and then I'm going to say this is going to be my unique orders. And to compute that, I want to take order ID and do in unique. All right. So that works. This returns a pandas data frame, at least when you code it this way, which this is kind of the form that I prefer because it tends to, I like the fact that it allows me to name the column as I'm going along, and it'll always return a data frame, so I have a consistent type coming back. So it returns a data frame. I've got a single column based on what I did for the aggregation, and then it creates in the index, or it creates an index based on what I grouped on, right? Let's look at how we would do this in polars, right? So if I've got my sales data PL, it's very similar. All right, so one thing, group by in polars is not a single word, it's group underscore by. And then you just give it what you want to perform that grouping on. We use ag again. All right. We can do that same syntax of defining a column and setting it equal to something. So but this has to follow our expression syntax. So instead of using this tuple to the right, we have to create an expression, and it's going to be PL call. We want to take that order ID column. All right, and we want to get the in unique. Let's refer to our documentation. I think I've got that pulled up. All right, so I'm here for the Python API. I'm in the expressions. Let's just look and see if we can happen to come across what would be. So for aggregation, I think that's just going to be, well, actually, so we can take the mean, the median, all of those. I don't see anything looking at so that is, of course, aggregating. It's computing aggregate metrics. Let's see. Do we have, so this is computation. There we go. So we have in unique. So they put it in the computation, but here's all the other methods that you could call. And I think this is actually really nice because actually figuring out for pandas, one of the methods you can use in a group by is a little bit challenging. I don't really know where that documentation is, right? Of figuring out, oh, well, how would I do that? But with polars, it's like, well, I've got an expression. Okay, well, it's a computation. Well, here's a nice list. If I've got an expression, I can call CBRT, assuming it's numeric, and get the cube root or the cosine or any of these things. So it's to me, I think the documentation, I think they've done a really good job of kind of doing that and laying that out where no documentation is, in my opinion, super easy to kind of navigate, right? Because most of the time, if you're consulting the documentation, you're not very familiar with a package, so you're trying to really, you're just kind of searching. But I do think they've struck a nice balance here, so I think it is pretty good. But we have an in unique, and notice instead of like in pandas, it just being one phrase in unique, it's actually in underscore unique. So that's a very common thing we see in polars. So we can do a dot in unique. And there we go. We get back a Polars data frame, but Polars data frames do not have index. They don't have an index. So instead of the thing that we're grouping on being in the index, it is in a column, right? And then we have our column there of unique orders. All right. Let's go back to our sales PD data. Let's get head 2. All right, what if we wanted to do like a comparison of like, okay, well, what's the unique number of orders by subcategory and region, right? So we have a region column. So we want to figure out by subcategory and region and maybe come up with like a table that's showing by region and subcategory what's the number of unique orders. All right. Well, if we were doing this in polars or in pandas, all we have to do, we need to add region to that. Okay, so now we're grouping by subcategory and region, and we got the unique number of orders. But the interesting thing is this is giving us back a data frame with a multi-index, right? So it's a weird, so if you want to grab bookcases in the central, you've kind of got to grab, you got to provide it with a tuple, right? So just to show you, if I wanted to get bookcases central, I have to do like a dot loc and say bookcases, comma, central, right? And we get that back as a series. It's kind of an interesting way that works. So what I like to do when I'm working in pandas, I don't like dealing with the multi-index, so I'm going to reset the index. That'll bring those columns that are in the index back in as columns in the data frame. It gives me a new index. We've always got to have an index. All right, and let's say we wanted to make that two-way table, right? So maybe we want to have region in the columns and subcategory in, from top to bottom, right? Or in the index. We could do that with a pivot. So I can say, well, okay, we'll take this data and pivot it such that the index is the subcategory. Right, the columns are based on whatever values are in this region column. And the values are based on whatever's in the unique orders column. And you notice here that I'm doing a very, this looks kind of like Polars code because I'm just chaining everything together because I know, okay, well, it's returning data frames and pivots a data frame, methods, so I can just chain those together. So we get this two-way table where we can kind of start to look and say, well, okay, well, overall, if I'm looking at which region tends to have the most sales, well, it's probably the West, right? And if I'm looking at which category, well, it's probably furnishings, but we can see, individual orders, unique orders containing those in each of those region subcategory pairs. All right, so how can we modify our polars implementation? Well, first off, we've got to put region here. All right, so that does our aggregation. So we don't have to do any reset index because it's putting those two group by columns in there just as columns in this data frame that it returns. All right, it also has a pivot method on Polars data frames where you specify an index, even though we don't technically have an index in polars. So I can say my index is my subcategory. The one difference that we have is instead of columns, it is on. So you say, what do you want to pivot on? And they did that so that they would be consistent because they also have a method called unpivot where if you've got, that two-way type of data frame, you can unpivot that back. And I might just demonstrate that real quickly. So we want to pivot on this, and we want our values to be based on unique orders. All right, so that does that two-way table. So that is pivoting. We went from long and we pivoted that to a wider format. You will notice that polars or pandas is sorting. those, the index and the columns, whereas Polars is not as much worried about that. You could, of course, go back in and do that sorting. But it's part of that's some of the implementation under the hood. So group by, I think, is definitely using multi-processing. So it just, it doesn't allow us to control that order as much. So it doesn't do that sort. And then just to show you, so that's how we do pivoting. And what if your original data came to you looking like this and you wanted to kind of unpivot that? So right now, let me just look at my columns. All right, so we've got central, east, south, and west. All right, so what if you want to get this into a longer format in pandas? So we originally had it long, we've pivoted it, and now we can do a melt. Okay, and what you have to do, let's look at the arguments for pandas melt. Let me pull up my documentation here. So I'm going to say pandas melt. So this is essentially unpivoting. So you have to specify some ID variables, some value variables, and so forth. So let's see if we can get this. So the columns to unpivot is what your value variables are going to be. So ID variables and value variables. All right. So let's go back. If I wanted to say unpivot it back down, I could say, well, my ID variables, well, I want that to just be, I don't really have anything because right now that subcategory is in the index. So that's going to be fine. Let's actually just run this with default. So in this case, we don't have anything we want to remain because it's in the index. So we should, let's see, did that run? Yeah, so one thing that we see here is it kind of messed up, right? So it took the thing out of the index. It just gave us a new index and it unpivoted that column. Right, so this is what we originally had. Put some space there. So what I would actually recommend is, again, do this reset index to bring that subcategory back into the columns. Okay. And now you can do a dot melt. And I'll say my ID variables. These are things I want to remain in each row. So that's going to be based on this subcategory. Right. And then it should take every other column, I think, and just melt that down. Right. So it did. And we've got region, and then it just put value there. Right. The reason it knew it was region is because if you look, it's kind of weird as this is kind of moving around on us. Right. So it was calling, if I were to look at the columns of the data frame, because of how we've melted this thing and pivoted it and everything and grouped by, here's your column names, but notice that that series, that index has a name called region. So that's how it knew when it did that melt to rename that column region, but it didn't know what to call value, right? So you can say, let's again look at our documentation. So pandas melt, we can give it a value name. And so if we did value name, and that was originally unique orders. All right, so we've kind of, at this point, got it back to what we originally had. So that shows you how you can do your pivoting and then your melting. All right. I'm just going to, let's just leave it all up. Let's time that. So doing the group by pivot, then we undid the pivot. All right, so 3.51 milliseconds. All right, so here we had our pivot operation on Polars. All right, and instead of melt, to keep the API somewhat consistent, they have an unpivot. All right, let's look at that. So I'm going to go to Polars. All right, and I think this will be maybe in our data frame. Let's say, is it in group by? It's probably not going to be in group by. Let's see if it's in manipulation selection. Let's see. So there's pivot. And then we have unpivot. All right. You specify on, you give an index. So these are going to be the columns. If on is empty, all columns that are not in the index will be used. So what we should be able to do is say index is equal to subcategory. So this is very similar to, and then we can just leave on blank. And there we go. It names them variable and value. So we need to figure out a way to get that back to our original names. All right, so we can say variable name and value name. Oops, sorry, I've got too many windows going. All right, so we can say variable name. That was going to be our region. And then value name is going to be unique orders. All right, so that's doing the pivoting and the unpivoting. And again, you can kind of see that, you know, they did pivot and unpivot to kind of make it easy to remember, because in pandas it's pivot and melt, right? So maybe unpivot's a little bit, you know, easier to think of. And then they've got ID vars versus index. So at least I kept the index consistent, and you can specify an on parameter here. Let's do a quick time it check. So the same operations, pandas was about 3.51 milliseconds versus 5.01. So, you know, let's do it exactly. So 3510. So it takes about 14%. So we're seeing significant speed up. So most of the things that we're seeing with Polars definitely are taking less than 20% of the time of pandas. And again, these are relatively straightforward operations. There are some cases where Polars can definitely lead to a much more substantial speed up. And again, pretty good succinct code, which in this case, even the pandas code, I think is very nice, very readable, very kind of an elegant presentation. All right, so that is grouping, aggregation, pivoting, and in this case, melting or unpivoting.